Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a really crucial area of cybersecurity,
Mm,
the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, Critical Security Controls.
that's right.
We've got some great source material here. Gives us a pretty comprehensive overview.
Mm.
We're looking specifically at parts 1 and 2 of their official documentation.
And our mission for this deep dive really is to be your guides through these really widely recognized cybersecurity best practices. We're going to unpack them, move beyond just the definitions to really understand the core concepts and, importantly, the actionable insights.
Actionable is key.
Exactly. The goal is to highlight what's most crucial, the core elements and safeguards, pulling directly from the source material so you can quickly get a handle on what's essential for building strong defenses.
All right, let's get straight into it then. At its core, what exactly are the CIS controls? For someone maybe hearing about them for the first time.
Okay, yeah. Think of them as a prioritized list, a set of actions, processes, best practices that organizations can actually adopt. They're specifically designed to beef up cybersecurity defenses, focusing on the most common and, frankly, the most impactful threats that we see out there in the real world.
So not just theoretical stuff.
Not at all. They're not just abstract ideas. They're really a pragmatic checklist. And it's built on understanding how attackers actually behave.
In this framework, it's been around a bit, hasn't it? It's evolved over time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the controls, they first came about way back in 2008. And it wasn't just, one company or group. It was an international consortium, a real mix of cybersecurity experts. These folks came from incredibly diverse backgrounds. You had military, government, all sorts of different industries, academics, people working hands-on in IT ops, right up to those making policy decisions. So that broad foundation is really key to why they're so practical, so applicable in the real world.
Makes sense.
And they've been constantly updated since then. Organizations like the SANS Institute, they're deeply involved. They provide significant support through training, certification, and ongoing research to keep the controls relevant and current.
Now, one of the big changes highlighted in the material is how the controls are organized now in version 8. It used to be structured differently, right?
Yeah.
Around who managed what.
That's a really, really important distinction in version 8. Yeah, the previous versions, like 7.1, they had controls with names like maintenance, monitoring, and securing of server software, or desktop and portable computers. Very device-centric.
Right, tied to the specific hardware or maybe an IT role.
Exactly, often tied to IT roles. Version 8 flipped that. It fundamentally changed things by organizing the controls based on the task or the activity being performed.
Okay, so less about the specific thing like a server and more about the action like protecting data or managing accounts.
Precisely. And this shift is so crucial because, well, the whole cybersecurity landscape has changed dramatically since '08.
Sure.
We've seen the absolute explosion of cloud computing where, you might not manage the physical server at all anymore. Remote work is just normal now, blending company devices with home networks.
Yeah, the lines are blurred.
Totally. And virtualization means assets aren't necessarily tied to physical boxes. So organizing by task things like account management or data protection makes the controls much more flexible, more adaptable, regardless of the underlying tech or, where the asset actually lives.
And did that reorganization change the number of controls?
It did, yeah. It actually streamlined things a bit. The number of controls went down from 20 in version 7.1 to 18 in version 8.
Okay. And within those controls, you have the specific recommendations, the safeguards. Did those change too?
Yes, the total number of safeguards also decreased slightly. Went from 171 in v7.1 down to 153 in version 8.
Still a lot of specifics, though.
Oh, yeah. But it's important to get what safeguards are. They're the granular, specific recommendations. They are the step-by-step technical and procedural ways you actually do the control, how you implement the objective. So yeah, the number went down a bit, but the focus is still very much on giving you concrete, actionable steps.
Got it. So beyond the structure and the specific steps, the controls themselves were designed with some core principles, some guiding ideas in mind. What were those?
Yeah, the source material lays out 5 core design principles. The first one is align. The idea here is that the controls aren't meant to be just another security framework you have to adopt in a vacuum.
Okay, that's good news for busy teams.
Definitely. They are intentionally designed to map to and actually support compliance with other major cybersecurity standards that organizations might already be using or, are required to follow.
Like what kind of standards are we talking about? NIST?
Exactly. Things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, COBIT, industry-specific regulations like HIPAA for healthcare,
Right.
NIST Special Publication 800-53 Revision 5, which you see a lot in government and federal areas, and even things like AICCA's Trust Services Criteria, which, forms the basis for SOC2 reports.
Which are critical for service providers.
Super critical. So this alignment makes the CIS controls a really compatible, broadly applicable foundation. It means the effort you put into implementing CIS controls often directly helps you meet requirements in those other frameworks too. It's not wasted effort.
Okay, so they play well with others. Designed to integrate, not conflict. What's the second principle?
Second is measurable. A key goal was to make implementing these controls and figuring out if they're working quantifiable.
You need to know if you're actually making progress.
Precisely. The language is designed to be simple, specific, avoids vague recommendations like improve security. How do you measure that?
Right.
If a control isn't clearly measurable, it's really hard to know if you're doing it right or if it's actually having the security impact you want.
Makes sense. You need to track progress, track effectiveness.
That's exactly.
Third principle, offense informs defense. Now, this one is maybe the most fundamental idea behind the CIS controls.
Okay.
The whole framework is explicitly based on analyzing huge amounts of data about actual cyber attacks. Attacker tactics, techniques, procedures, TTPs, what the adversaries are really doing out there.
So the controls are basically a defensive playbook built from watching the offense.
That's exactly the idea. They're designed to give you effective countermeasures against the threats that pose the biggest risk, the ones happening most often and causing the most damage. It's a threat-informed approach, and it gets updated as attackers change their methods.
That makes them really practical. Fourth principle.
Fourth is focus. Look, organizations, especially smaller ones, face huge resource constraints, right? Time, budget, people.
Always the challenge.
Always. The CIS controls help organizations prioritize. They focus your efforts on the set of controls that, when you implement them, will give you the biggest bang for your buck, the most significant risk reduction against the most common threats. So it helps you concentrate those limited resources where they'll have the biggest impact instead of trying to boil the ocean.
Right. It cuts through the noise, the information overload, addresses that limited capacity problem by guiding you to the most critical actions first.
Okay. And the last one.
And finally, feasible. All the recommendations, the controls, and the safeguards within them are intended to be practical. Things that organizations of different types, different sizes, can actually adopt and implement.
Practicality is huge.
Yeah.
Recommendations are only useful if teams can actually put them into practice in the real world, right?
Totally agree. And that principle, feasibility, leads us perfectly into the next concept, implementation groups, or IGs.
Oh.
Because even with prioritization, a small business owner with maybe one IT person just can't implement the same level of security as, say, a huge corporation with a dedicated security army.
Right. So this is how the framework scales, how it becomes achievable for different kinds of organizations.
Exactly. The source material describes 3 categories. They're self-assessed. You look at your own organization, your characteristics, your resources, how sensitive the data you handle is, and you figure out which group you fit into.
And that tells you which safeguards to focus on.
Precisely. It guides you to a specific subset of those 153 safeguards that are most critical for your level of maturity and your specific risk profile.
Okay, let's break down those groups, starting with IG1.
Okay, IG1. It's known as essential cyber hygiene. Think small or medium-sized organizations here. They usually have, limited resources dedicated purely to cybersecurity.
Maybe a small IT staff, or even just one person doing everything.
Could be a small IT staff, or maybe IT is handled by a generalist, not dedicated security pros.
Wow.
Their IT asset count might also be relatively small compared to a large enterprise.
And what are their defining characteristics, their main worries?
Their main focus, honestly, is just keeping the core business running, keep the lights on. They often have limited dedicated cybersecurity expertise in-house. The data they handle, while obviously important to them, is generally less sensitive compared to, say, a bank or a hospital. Think general business data, maybe not vast troves of highly confidential personal info.
But downtime would still hurt them badly.
Critically, a significant period of downtime from a cyber incident, it could be incredibly damaging, maybe even existential for a small business. So the safeguards assigned to IG1 are considered the absolute bedrock. Foundational cyber hygiene steps that any organization really needs to implement to defend against common, opportunistic attacks. Stuff like basic password hygiene, patching, simple backups.
Okay, so IG1 is the baseline. Fundamental protections to keep the business operational. What about IG2?
IG2 is for companies that are a bit more complex. They typically have dedicated IT staff, maybe supporting multiple departments. Each department might have different risk profiles, different tech needs. They've moved beyond just one or two people handling everything IT.
Yeah, and their data situation is probably different too.
Significantly different, usually. IG2 organizations typically handle sensitive client data. That immediately bumps up their risk level compared to IG1.
Right.
A data breach for them wouldn't just be disruptive. It could mean big financial penalties, legal trouble, and critically, a major loss of customer trust and reputation. That's often their biggest fear.
Can they tolerate any downtime?
Maybe short service interruptions, but their main concern shifts towards protecting that sensitive information and maintaining trust. So these organizations, they implement all the safeguards from IG1, plus an additional set of safeguards tailored to handle their increased complexity and data sensitivity. They build on that IG1 foundation.
Got it. And then IG3 must be the most mature, highest risk profile?
Correct. Organizations falling into IG3 are typically your large enterprises or maybe organizations in highly regulated sectors. They usually have dedicated security experts, sometimes whole teams covering specialized areas, penetration testing, risk management, application security, threat intel, you name it.
Handling the really sensitive stuff?
Yeah. Yes. The data assets they manage are highly sensitive, often subject to really stringent compliance rules and regulatory oversight. Think major financial institutions, large healthcare providers, critical infrastructure operators.
The impact of an attack there could be huge.
Catastrophic, potentially. Not just for the company itself, but it could cause significant harm to the public, disrupting essential services, mass identity theft, maybe even impacting national security. So IG3 organizations implement everything from IG1 and IG2, plus another set of safeguards for really comprehensive advanced protection.
That makes a lot of sense. It lays out a clear path, doesn't it? Start with the essentials, layer on more as the organization grows, handles more sensitive data.
Exactly.
It means you don't have to feel overwhelmed by trying to tackle all 153 safeguards right out of the gate.
Exactly right. You can start with that essential hygiene, mature your security program over time, using the framework and your own changing risk profile as a guide. It's a roadmap.
Okay, fantastic. Now that we've got the foundation, the principles, the structure, the IGs, let's dive into the controls themselves. We'll tackle the first 9, focusing on, the core idea, why it matters, maybe some challenges, and how specific safeguards help.
Sounds good. Control 01. This one's all about inventory and control of enterprise assets. The objective sounds simple, maybe deceptively so. Actively track and manage all IT assets connected to your network or environment.
All assets. That includes physical, virtual, cloud.
Everything. Physical devices like laptops, servers, virtual machines, any assets you have running in cloud environments. Everything.
Why is just knowing what you have so fundamental? Step 1.
Because, quite literally, you cannot protect what you don't know exists or where it is.
Right. Can't secure ghosts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you don't have a complete inventory, you've got blind spots. Devices that aren't monitored aren't getting patched. Maybe you have insecure settings. Attackers love those blind spots. Having a comprehensive, up-to-date inventory gives you the essential visibility you need for basically every other security control that follows.
And what kind of info should be in that inventory?
The source material gives good examples. You need an asset description, some unique identifier like a serial number, who it's assigned to, its warranty expiration date, and really critically, its support end-of-life date.
Tracking support end of life. That seems really important for planning ahead, avoiding risks from old tech.
It's huge. A device running an unsupported OS or software, that's a massive vulnerability waiting to be exploited. And beyond just tracking the hardware itself, a good inventory helps you understand the bigger picture, how data flows through your environment.
How so?
Well, knowing which specific devices or systems, like, say, your main database servers or the HR department's laptop store or process sensitive information, that helps your IT and security teams prioritize. Where should they focus their limited resources for monitoring, patching, stricter access controls? The inventory guides that.
I can imagine this is a huge challenge, though, especially today. You've got remote workers, guest networks, IoT devices popping up everywhere, printers, cameras.
Oh, it's a massive challenge. The source material definitely highlights issues like, external devices brought in by guests or auditors. What about permanent access for your managed service providers, your MSPs, who manage parts of your network?
Good point.
And increasingly, those portable end-user devices, laptops, tablets that connect to the company network sometimes, then go back offline. Keeping an accurate, real-time inventory across all that dynamic stuff, it takes more than just a spreadsheet. You need automation.
So the safeguards for Control 01 probably focus heavily on discovery tools and automated tracking.
Exactly. A lot of the key safeguards, especially the ones prioritized for IG1, are about automating discovery and keeping that inventory maintained. Establishing and maintaining a detailed asset inventory, that's the main goal.
Right.
Specific safeguards include using an active discovery tool, something that scans the network looking for connected devices, and maybe a passive asset discovery tool, which identifies devices by just listening to network traffic without actively scanning.
Less intrusive sometimes.
Can be. Using DHCP logging, which records which device got which network address. That's another simple IG1 safeguard to help spot active devices. And crucially, there are safeguards around having a process for addressing unauthorized assets when they are discovered. You find something weird, what do? Approve it or remove it.
Makes sense. Need a plan.
Yeah, these primarily fall under the identify and detect functions in the CIS framework.
Okay, that lays a really solid foundation, knowing what hardware you have.
Mm-hmm.
So if Control A1 is hardware, Control O2 feels like the logical next step, inventory and control of software assets.
Precisely. It's the direct counterpart. The goal here is similar. Track and actively manage all the software applications running inside the organization's environment.
Why is that so critical?
Well, it's critical to make sure that only authorized software is installed, and just as importantly, that any unmanaged or unauthorized software gets found and dealt with.
What kind of software falls under this? Is it just the big applications?
No, it's really broad. It includes operating systems on servers and endpoints, any programming software your teams might use internally, all your business apps, CRM, ERP, productivity stuff,
Okay.
hardware drivers, open source software components you might be using, even device firmware. It all counts as a software asset.
And why is this inventory so critical? Similar reasons to hardware, I guess, but maybe some software-specific risks.
Yeah, many of the same reasons, plus some extras. A good software inventory is absolutely essential for tracking patch levels. Knowing which applications have outstanding security updates, that's paramount for vulnerability management, which we'll get to.
Right, knowing what needs fixing.
Exactly.
Oh.
It also tells you which applications are maybe nearing end of life, meaning they won't get security patches anymore, so you need to plan to replace or migrate off them. And of course, it helps you identify unauthorized software.
Which could be anything from risky personal apps to actual malware.
Could be. Anything from, personal file sharing apps that introduce risk, maybe license compliance issues, right up to actual malicious programs disguised as legitimate tools. The source mentions using tools that can inventory software and automatically check it against databases of common applications. That lets you quickly see versions, known patch levels, potential risks.
Okay. And Control O2 also introduces this concept of allow listing. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, allow listing, sometimes called application allow listing, is a really powerful proactive defense strategy.
How does it work?
So instead of the traditional antivirus approach of trying to block known bad software that's blacklisting, allow listing flips it, you create a list of only the software applications, libraries, scripts, maybe even specific versions that are explicitly authorized to run on your systems.
And anything not on the list?
It's blocked, prevented from executing or loading.
Wow, that seems like it would drastically cut down the risk from rogue software or malware.
It's incredibly effective, especially against malware, ransomware, things that might not have known signatures yet because they're new. It directly tackles that risk of users installing sketchy or unwanted software.
So what are some key safeguards for Control O2?
Well, establishing and maintaining that software inventory, that's an IG1 priority. Making sure your authorized software is actually currently supported, getting patches, also IG1. Having a process to address unauthorized software when you find it, IG1 again.
Basics first.
Right. Using automated software inventory tools becomes really important for efficiency as you scale. And then implementing that allow listing for software, libraries, scripts, that's a really strong protect safeguard, though maybe more for IG2, IG3 depending on complexity. These safeguards together help you understand and critically control what's actually running on your systems.
Okay, so we've inventoried assets and software. Control O3 gets right to the heart of it. Data protection.
Yeah, this one is absolutely fundamental. It's focused on securing the data itself through its entire life cycle in your organization.
The whole life cycle.
Yeah.
From creation to deletion.
Exactly. From the moment data is created or maybe acquired, through how it's stored, used, shared, archived, and ultimately how it's securely disposed of when you don't need it anymore.
So step one here must be understanding what data you actually have.
Absolutely. The first critical step is data identification, then archiving, labeling, and maybe most importantly, classification. You need to categorize your data based on how sensitive it is, how important it is to the business.
Why is classification so key?
It helps you understand the potential impact if that data were lost, stolen, or compromised. Classification is often, discretionary based on your own internal policies, maybe labels like public, internal, sensitive, confidential, but it's also heavily influenced by your industry and any regulations or privacy laws you have to follow.
Like iPay for health data or GDPR for personal data in Europe, things like that.
Exactly, those kinds of regulations often mandate how certain types of data must be classified and handled. There's no discretion there.
Okay, so once you've classified your data,
Then the source emphasizes creating data mapping. This means figuring out where your sensitive data actually lives, which servers, which databases, which cloud storage, where does it move, what are the data flows, and which applications, systems, or users need to access data at different sensitivity levels.
how does mapping that out help with security?
Oh, it's invaluable, both for prioritizing and for architecture. Knowing that, say, your main customer database contains confidential information lets you focus stricter security controls, maybe more monitoring, tighter access right on that specific system.
Makes sense. Protect the crown jewels more carefully.
Right. And it can also inform things like network segmentation. Maybe you decide to isolate your most sensitive data stores on separate, more protected network segments. So even if an attacker breaches, say, your web server network, they still can't easily get to the core financial data. Yeah. And based on that classification and mapping, you then start implementing specific tailored controls. Things like setting appropriate data retention periods. How long do you keep stuff? Configuring access control lists, or ACLs, to enforce least privilege on who can actually access the data. Implementing specific logging just for access to sensitive data. And developing clear, secure data disposal plans for when data reaches its end of life. Can't just drag it to the recycle bin.
And encryption plays a big role here, I assume.
Huge role. Encryption is a really strategic tool in data protection. It's used to secure data both at rest, meaning when it's just sitting there, stored on a hard drive in a database, in the cloud, and in transit, when it's being sent across a network, even internally or over the internet.
So even if someone gets their hands on the data.
If it's properly encrypted, it's basically useless to them without the decryption key. It's a critical layer of defense.
This feels like one of the most complex controls, just because data is everywhere and flows everywhere. What are some of the key safeguards highlighted?
Yeah, Control-O3 has quite a few safeguards, and they span different functions: identify, protect, detect, and different IGs. Foundational ones, often landing in IG1, include establishing a data management process overall, maintaining a data inventory, having that classification scheme, and documenting your data flows.
Getting the basics documented.
Right. Then, critical protect safeguards, which apply across IGs depending on scope, include configuring those data access control lists, enforcing data retention rules, and securely disposing of data. Encrypting data is huge here, too. Encrypting data on end-user devices is an IG1 priority. Then encrypting it on removable media, encrypting sensitive data when it's in transit across networks, and encrypting sensitive data when it's at rest in storage. These are all highlighted.
What about more advanced stuff?
For higher IGs like IG2 and IG3, you see safeguards like segmenting data processing and storage based on sensitivity, that network isolation idea we talked about, and deploying a data loss prevention, or DLP, solution.
What does DLP do?
DLP tools actively monitor data leaving the organization through email, web uploads, USB drives, and can block or alert on transmissions containing sensitive information based on your classification rules. It's a powerful control for preventing accidental or malicious data leakage.
That's a really deep dive just into data. Okay, Control-O4 is secure configuration of enterprise assets and software.
Right. This control is all about establishing and then maintaining secure baseline configurations for pretty much all your technology assets.
So hardening everything.
Essentially, yes. This includes network devices, routers, switches, firewalls, mobile and portable devices, IoT devices, which are everywhere now, servers, workstations, operating systems, hardware components, and all sorts of software applications, setting them up securely from the start and keeping them that way.
And the big risk here is often the default settings they come with out of the box.
Absolutely. That's a huge entry point for attackers. The vast majority of devices and software, they're shipped with default configurations optimized for ease of use, quick setup, not necessarily for security.
Makes sense for the vendor, maybe not for the user.
Exactly. These defaults often include things like unnecessary services running in the background, network ports left open, standard default usernames and passwords, or overly permissive access settings. Attackers know these defaults like the back of their hand, and they actively scan networks looking for systems that haven't been changed.
So step one is changing those defaults.
Step one is having a process. Organizations must have a process to assess those default settings, harden them, which means removing or disabling the vulnerable configurations, and then continuously review and maintain these secure baselines over time. It's not a one-and-done thing.
Are there resources out there to help organizations figure out what a secure baseline actually looks like? It sounds complicated.
Yeah, thankfully you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The source mentions using publicly available hardening guides and benchmarks. The CIS Benchmarks program itself is a fantastic resource. They provide detailed configuration guidelines for tons of different operating systems, applications, cloud platforms, network devices.
Yeah.
NIST's National Checklist Program Repository is another excellent place to look. Using these established guides gives you a really strong starting point and also helps with compliance, right? You can demonstrate you're following recognized standards.
So security hardening is the practical application of this control. What does that actually involve?
Exactly. Hardening is the process of making a system less vulnerable by reducing its attack surface. What can an attacker potentially target? Let's shrink that. So steps involve things like uninstalling any software or services that aren't absolutely required for the device's main function, closing network ports that don't need to be open, changing all default passwords — you'd be amazed how often that's missed — turning off non-essential features, basically locking things down.
And what about tools to help enforce these configurations across lots of devices?
Yeah, configuration management tools become essential, especially at scale. Things like firewalls, intrusion detection prevention systems, IDS-PS, those DLP systems we mentioned, and mobile device management MDM software all play a part in implementing and enforcing these secure baselines across different types of assets.
And you might need different baselines for different systems.
Definitely. Organizations with complex environments or maybe different parts of the business handling data with varying sensitivity levels might need multiple distinct secure baselines. A web server facing the internet needs a different baseline than an internal HR database server. And the process isn't just setup, it's continuous monitoring to detect any configuration drift, any deviation from that established secure state.
What are some key safeguards for Control-O4?
Foundational ones, often IG1, include establishing and maintaining a secure configuration process, having a plan for how you do this for both enterprise asset software generally and specifically for network infrastructure.
Okay.
Then, specific hardening steps include things like configuring automatic session locking on devices after inactivity, IG1, managing those default accounts, changing passwords, disabling unused ones, IG1, uninstalling or disabling unnecessary services, IG1. Implementing and managing firewalls on servers and end-user devices is crucial, IG1, IG2. For portable devices, enforcing automatic device lockout after failed login attempts and enabling remote wipe capabilities, IG1, IG2, are key. And separating enterprise workspaces from personal stuff on mobile devices, IG2, helps contain risk. Using trusted VNS servers, IG1, also adds a layer against malicious websites.
That covers a lot of ground, from basic workstation settings right up to network gear. Okay, Control-O5 is account management.
Right. This control dives deep into managing the identities that access your systems. It's all about securely managing the entire lifecycle of user accounts for regular employees, privileged accounts, those admin accounts with extra power, and service accounts, the ones used by applications or services, not people.
I'm sensing a theme here. Inventory is probably key again.
Absolutely critical. Just like hardware and software, you need a complete and accurate inventory of all accounts across all your systems and applications. If you don't know an account exists, you can't manage it, you can't secure it, you can't disable it when someone leaves.
Makes sense.
Centralized identity and access management tools, often called IAM solutions, can significantly help with maintaining this inventory and managing the account lifecycle: creation, modification, deletion.
And beyond just knowing the accounts.
Clear policies and user training are vital. You need an acceptable use policy for system access, clear guidelines for users on treating their credentials, passwords, tokens as highly sensitive information, and formal training on security best practices.
Like password rules.
Exactly. Things like password complexity requirements, password history, rules against reuse. Also, understanding account inactivity controls what happens if you don't log in for 90 days, and knowing about lockout policies, what happens after too many failed login attempts. Users need to understand these things.
What about those privileged accounts? They seem like high-value targets.
They are prime targets. They require special handling. Accounts with administrative privileges should be strictly limited, only given to those who absolutely need them. And ideally, they should be used only for specific administrative tasks, not for everyday work like checking email or browsing the web.
So, separate accounts for admin tasks.
That's a common best practice. Require users who need admin rights to have two accounts: a standard user account for their daily tasks, and a dedicated separate administrative account used only when those elevated permissions are strictly necessary. Why? Because it reduces the risk. If their standard account gets compromised, maybe through a phishing email, the attacker doesn't immediately get admin rights to everything.
Smart. What about service accounts?
Those also need careful management. They're often overlooked. You need clear documentation for each service account: who owns it, what is its specific purpose, what systems does it need access to. Poorly managed service accounts with old passwords can be a huge vulnerability.
And this is where different authentication methods become really important, right? Like SSO and MFA.
Yes, this control ties directly into authentication strategy. Single sign-on SSO is really popular for convenience. Users love it. One login gets you into multiple applications.
But it has a downside.
It concentrates risk. If that single SSO password gets breached, an attacker could potentially access many systems tied to it, which is why multi-factor authentication, MFA, is such a fundamental, essential security control highlighted right here.
MFA requiring something more than just the password.
Exactly. MFA demands that a user provides two or more different types of validation before they get access. It's usually a combination of something they know, like a password or PIN, something they have, like their phone getting a code or a physical hardware token, or something they are, like a fingerprint or face scan.
And that makes a huge difference if a password gets stolen.
Huge. Implementing MFA, especially for privileged accounts, any remote access, and access to sensitive applications, drastically reduces the risk of account compromise. Even if a password gets stolen or guessed, it's probably one of the single most effective controls you can implement.
What are the key safeguards for account management?
Okay, foundational safeguards hitting IG1 include establishing and maintaining that inventory of accounts, requiring unique passwords across systems that's applicable to all IGs. You can't reuse passwords. Disabling dormant accounts after a period of inactivity, also IG1 to IG3, and restricting administrator privileges to those dedicated admin accounts, again, critical for all IGs.
What about for the higher IGs?
For IG2 and IG3, priorities include establishing an inventory specifically for those service accounts we talked about, and moving towards centralizing account management, using those IAM tools for better control and visibility, reflecting the increased complexity of their environments.
Okay, that makes sense. Building directly on Control-O5 is Control-O6. Access control management. How is this different?
Right, so if Control-O5 is about managing the accounts themselves, the who can log in. Control-O6 is all about defining what those accounts can actually do once they're authenticated. It's about permissions. What can they access and what level of access do they have? Read, write, delete.
Got it. And the core principles here are often called least privilege and need to know.
Those are the absolute bedrock principles of good access control. You hear them all the time for a reason. Least privilege dictates that users should only be granted the absolute minimum set of permissions necessary to perform their specific job duties. No more, no less.
And need to know.
Need to know is closely related. It means limiting access to systems, data, resources only to those specific individuals whose job actually requires that access. Don't give people access just because it's easier or just in case.
Why are these so important?
Violating these principles is a major security vulnerability. If an account with excessive privileges gets compromised, the potential damage is much greater. It allows attackers who steal credentials to potentially move laterally within the network much more easily, accessing things they shouldn't be able to. Least privilege contains the blast radius.
So how are these principles actually managed and enforced in practice?
Well, the technical systems that handle this, the authentication and authorization systems that validate identities and enforce permissions, they need to be inventoried, like everything else, and ideally managed centrally for consistency and oversight.
And processes are key, too.
Absolutely. Establishing clear, documented processes for granting access when someone joins the company or changes roles is vital. But equally, if not more critical, is having a robust, timely process for revoking access promptly when an employee leaves or their role no longer requires that access. Any delay in removing access is a significant security gap. Orphaned accounts are dangerous.
The source mentions role-based access control, or RBAC here. How does that help?
Yes, RBAC is a very common and effective model for managing permissions, especially in larger organizations. Instead of trying to assign permissions individually to every single user, which quickly becomes an unmanageable nightmare, you define roles within the organization.
Like HR manager or sales rep?
Exactly. HR manager, finance analyst, IT administrator, whatever fits your structure. You assign the necessary permissions to the role. Then you simply assign users to one or more roles, and they automatically inherit the permissions associated with those roles.
That sounds much cleaner.
It streamlines management hugely. It helps enforce least privilege because you're defining permissions based on job function. And it also helps facilitate separation of duties, making sure no single role has conflicting or excessive permissions that could enable fraud or errors.
And those extra layers we talked about, like MFA and maybe privileged account management, PAM, they fit in here too for sensitive access.
Definitely. While MFA is covered under Account Management, Control 05, applying MFA specifically for remote access or administrative access, or access to highly sensitive systems or data, those are critical access control safeguards, Control 06. And privileged account management, or PAM, solutions. They provide extra security specifically for those high-risk administrative or service accounts. Often involves things like secure password vaults, automatic password rotation, session monitoring and recording for admin activities, and maybe just-in-time access granting where privileges are only given temporarily when needed.
You really highlighted quick deprovisioning, removing access as crucial.
It cannot be stressed enough. The ideal scenario, especially for larger organizations, is some kind of comprehensive IAM solution that can automatically, or at least near synchronously, remove an employee's access across all relevant applications and systems the moment they are terminated or change roles. Doing it manually, system by system, it's just too slow and prone to errors. Someone always gets missed.
Makes sense. What are the key safeguards for access control management?
Okay, foundational safeguards, IG1 level, include establishing those clear processes for granting access and, critically, for revoking access promptly. Then, requiring multi-factor authentication is highlighted across several safeguards, but their IG level varies depending on what is being accessed. MFA, for externally exposed applications, is an IG1 priority. MFA for remote network access is generally IG2, and MFA for administrative access is often considered IG3. The highest priority access to protect.
Okay, different levels of MFA for different risks.
Right. Then for higher IGs, like IG2, priorities include establishing an inventory of your authentication and authorization systems, knowing what controls access where, centralizing access control management where possible, and formally defining and maintaining that role-based access control model we discussed.
Got it. Okay, next up, Control 07, Continuous Vulnerability Management.
This control is all about being proactive, continuously identifying, tracking, and then fixing, remediating vulnerabilities in your systems and software.
Why is the word continuous so important here? It's not just a one-time scan.
Absolutely not, because the threat landscape is constantly changing. New vulnerabilities in operating systems, applications, firmware, hardware, they're discovered literally every single day. And attackers, they are relentless. They're constantly scanning the internet, scanning internal networks, looking for these known weaknesses, because frankly, exploiting a known, unpatched vulnerability is often the easiest way for them to get initial access or escalate their privileges once they're inside.
So security isn't a one-time setup, it's an ongoing race.
It's absolutely an ongoing race. You have to keep finding and patching those vulnerabilities before the hackers find and exploit them.
And that brings up the term zero-day exploits, right? Those are the really nasty ones.
0 days are particularly challenging, yeah. These are security flaws that are, by definition, unknown to the software or hardware vendor, and therefore unknown to security teams when they are first exploited by attackers.
So there's no patch available yet.
Exactly. That gives the attackers a significant advantage, a window of opportunity, because no patch or effective defense exists until the vendor discovers the vulnerability, develops a fix, and then organizations deploy that fix. Proactive vulnerability management aims to shrink that window as much as possible for all the known vulnerabilities out there. You can't stop 0 days directly, but you can reduce the overall attack surface.
So organizations need to be constantly scanning, monitoring, looking for these weaknesses.
Exactly. The control emphasizes performing automated vulnerability scans of your internal systems, external-facing systems. As new vulnerabilities are found by these scans, you need a process. You need to assess their severity. How bad is it? The likelihood of exploitation, is this something attackers are actively using? And the potential impact on your specific organization.
Because you can't fix everything at once.
No way. This assessment is crucial for prioritizing. Which vulnerabilities pose the biggest immediate risk? Fix those first.
Are there standard ways to assess that severity and prioritize?
Yes, thankfully. The source mentions widely adopted classification schemes. The Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, is a big one. It gives a numerical score, typically 0 to 10, indicating the severity of a vulnerability based on various factors.
Higher score means worse vulnerability.
Generally, yes. And the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures List, the CVE list, is like a dictionary. It gives a unique ID number to each publicly known cybersecurity vulnerability. Using these standards helps organizations speak the same language, assess risk consistently, and prioritize their remediation efforts based on objective criteria.
What are the key safeguards for vulnerability management then?
Foundational safeguards, hitting IG1, include establishing and maintaining a vulnerability management process. How do you find them? And establishing and maintaining a remediation process. How do you fix them? You need both plans. Performing automated vulnerability scans of your internal assets is an IG1 priority.
Patching seems critical here too.
Absolutely. Automated operating system and application patch management is a crucial safeguard. IG1, IG2, depending on the scope and automation level, you have to apply the fixes. Performing automated scans of your externally exposed assets, your web servers, VPN gateways, that becomes an IG2 priority, focusing on that critical public-facing attack surface. And of course, the essential final step is actually remediating the detected vulnerabilities. IG1 priority. Fighting them isn't enough. You have to fix them.
Makes sense. Okay, moving on to Control 08, Audit Log Management. This sounds important for figuring out what happened after something goes wrong.
It's incredibly important for that, but also for detection before things go really wrong. This control is about collecting, managing, and analyzing security logs from all sorts of systems and devices across your environment. These logs are often invaluable. Sometimes they're the only way to detect malicious activity as it's happening, or to investigate incidents after they occur and piece together what actually happened.
What kind of information do these logs typically capture?
Logs basically record events that happen on systems. The source material distinguishes between two main types. You have system logs, which record things like system startup and shutdown times, services starting or stopping, maybe errors or crashes, restoration points.
Okay, system health type stuff.
Right. And then you have audit logs, which are specifically tied to user activity. Who logged in? From where? When did they access this specific file? Which application did they open? What command did they run on the command line? Both types are really critical for security.
Why are these event and audit logs so critical during an incident response?
They provide the digital breadcrumbs, the forensic trail. During an incident investigation, logs are absolutely essential for understanding the timeline of the attack. When did it start? What was the initial point of entry? How did the attacker move laterally through the network? Which systems or data were accessed or potentially stolen? Without good logs, you're largely flying blind when trying to respond.
And they have uses beyond just incident response.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Beyond IR, logs are vital for digital forensics, potentially supporting legal proceedings like e-discovery requests. They help ensure accountability for actions taken on systems. They can help you identify patterns that might indicate policy violations or even just operational inefficiencies. And importantly, many compliance regulations have specific requirements about what logs you need to collect and how long you need to retain them. So log management is often a compliance requirement too.
So it's a whole process again, isn't it? From collecting them to storing them to actually looking at them.
Exactly. The log management process covers that entire life cycle. First, deciding what logs to collect from which sources, servers, workstations, network devices, firewalls, cloud services, VPNs, maybe even physical access systems. Then, ensuring they're collected reliably and haven't been tampered with, storing them securely for the required retention period, and then critically analyzing them. Just collecting logs and letting them sit isn't enough.
What should you look for in the analysis?
The source notes the importance of logging things like failed login attempts. A bunch of those might indicate a brute force password attack is underway. And tools like security information and event management SIEM systems are designed specifically for this analysis part.
How do SIEMs help?
They're powerful. They centralize logs from all those disparate sources into one place. They normalize the data so different log formats can be understood together. And they provide powerful correlation engines and analysis capabilities. They help security analysts spot anomalies, recognize patterns of malicious activity, or correlate events across different systems that might look innocent in isolation, but are suspicious when combined. Stuff that would be almost impossible to find just manually reading individual log files.
So using a SIEM really shifts log management from just reactive storage to potentially proactive detection.
That's exactly the goal.
Yeah.
It aims to turn that raw log data into actionable security intelligence.
What are the key safeguards for Control-08?
Okay, Control-08 safeguards span identify, detect, and protect functions and various IGs. Foundational safeguards applicable across all IGs include establishing and maintaining an audit log management process overall, actually collecting the audit logs, ensuring you have adequate storage for them, and, really importantly, standardizing time synchronization across all your systems using something like NTT, Network Time Protocol.
Why is time sync so important?
Because if the clocks on different systems are off, you can't accurately correlate events between them. You can't build a reliable timeline of an attack if one server thinks it's 10.05 and another thinks it's 10.03 when the same event happens. So synchronized time is crucial.
Got it. What about for higher IGs?
For IG2 and IG3, the priorities shift towards collecting more detailed logs, things like DNS queries, where are users trying to go, URL requests from web proxies, even command line activity on endpoints. Centralizing those logs into a SIEM or a similar log analysis platform becomes key. Rotating logs for longer periods is often required. Conducting regular, proactive audit log reviews, not just waiting for an incident, and even collecting relevant logs from your key service providers, an IG3 safeguard.
That gives you really deep visibility into what's actually happening across the board. Okay, Control-09 focuses squarely on a major attack vector, email and web browser protections.
Yeah, this control directly addresses the huge risks that come through everyday user interaction with email and the internet. Your email client and your web browser, they are often the primary way users access external information and interact with the outside world, and that makes them prime targets for attackers trying to deliver malicious content or launch social engineering attacks directly at your employees.
Phishing is the classic example here, right?
Yeah.
It's still a huge problem.
Huge. Absolutely. Phishing attacks where attackers send fraudulent emails trying to trick recipients into clicking malicious links, opening infected attachments, or revealing sensitive information like passwords, they're incredibly common and still depressingly effective.
And then there's business email compromise.
Right, BEC. That's often a more targeted form of phishing. Attackers might impersonate executives, the CEO, or maybe a known business partner or vendor, trying to trick employees, often in finance or HR, into doing something like wiring funds to a fraudulent account or sending over confidential employee data like W-2s. The losses from BEC can be devastating.
And it's not just about tricking the user. The software itself can be vulnerable.
Exactly. Beyond the social engineering aspect, vulnerabilities in the web browser or email client software itself can be exploited. If users are running outdated or unsupported versions, just visiting a compromised website or even opening a specially crafted email, sometimes without even clicking anything, could be enough to install malware on their system.
Sir, what are the layers of defense recommended here? How do you protect against this?
It's really a combination of technical controls and that security awareness training we'll get to later, Control 14. On the technical side, measures include implementing things like DNS filtering services or network-based URL filters. These tools block access to known malicious or blacklisted websites at the network level before the user even gets there.
Okay, stopping them reaching bad places.
Right. Blocking potentially dangerous file types that are commonly used to deliver malware, things like executable files, .exe, script files, GSATSs, maybe at the email gateway or the network perimeter is another key safeguard. Restricting what users can do within the browser or email client, like disabling user-installed extensions or add-ons, which can sometimes be malicious or have vulnerabilities, helps reduce the potential attack surface.
What about protecting the email domain itself?
Yeah. The source highlights implementing email authentication mechanisms. The big one is DMRC, Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. DMRs, along with its underlying technologies SPF and DKIM, helps prevent attackers from spoofing your organization's email domain. It makes it much harder for them to send phishing emails that look like they legitimately came from your company.
That sounds like it directly counters a lot of BEC and phishing where they pretend to be internal.
It's a key technology for fighting that, yes. It helps receiving email servers verify that an email claiming to be from your domain actually originated from an authorized server associated with your domain. And deploying robust anti-malware protections directly on your email servers, scanning both incoming and outgoing mail for threats, is also crucial.
So key safeguards for Control 09.
Ensure that only fully supported browsers and email clients are used. Patching is critical here. Unsupported versions are major risks. Using those DNS filtering services, IG1, IG2, IG3, and maintaining network-based URL filters, IG1, IG2, IG3, are high-priority protect safeguards, blocking access to bad sites. Restricting unnecessary browser or email client extensions, IG1, IG2, IG3, implementing DR, blocking those unnecessary risky file types at the gateway, and deploying and maintaining email server anti-malware protections. These safeguards work together to try and protect the user at that critical interface point with the external internet.
Okay, that wraps up a really dense first 9 controls, covering those essential foundational steps from inventory and secure configurations to managing accounts and access, handling vulnerabilities, managing logs, and protecting those super common attack vectors like email and web browsing.
Yeah, these first 9 really establish the bedrock, don't they? The foundation of a solid security program. They focus heavily on getting visibility, the identify function, hardening your systems, the protect function, and detecting suspicious activity, the detect function, across your core assets and systems. It's about getting the basics right.
All right, let's transition now. We'll move into the next set of controls, 10 through 18. These seem to dive a bit deeper into specific defenses and maybe more advanced practices, starting with Control 10, malware defenses.
Right, so building on protecting those common entry points like email and web, Control 09, this control's main objective is to prevent malicious software malware from getting installed, spreading, and actually running, executing on your organization's assets and across your network.
And when we say malware, we're talking about the whole nasty spectrum. Viruses, ransomware.
Exactly. Viruses, worms that spread themselves, spyware snooping on users, adware popping up annoying ads, keyloggers capturing keystrokes, and yeah, crucially, ransomware that encrypts your files and holds them hostage. It all falls under the malware umbrella.
And endpoints are the main battleground.
Endpoints, laptops, desktops, servers are definitely the most common targets for malware delivery and execution. Once malware gets onto an endpoint, it can cause immense damage. Stealing credentials, encrypting critical data for ransom, destroying systems altogether, or maybe just sitting there quietly, establishing persistent access for the attacker to come back later.
So anti-malware software, antivirus, endpoint protection, that's the obvious primary defense here, right?
It's a primary defense, absolutely, but it's not the only one, and it's not foolproof. Anti-malware solutions should definitely be deployed across all potential entry points and assets. They need to be centrally managed so you can enforce consistent policies and see the status across the board. And critically, they need to be configured for automatic signature updates.
Because new malware comes out all the time.
Constantly. Malware signatures, the patterns traditional antivirus looks for change daily, even hourly. Outdated anti-malware software is pretty much useless against new threats.
So signatures are important, but what else?
Beyond just signature-based detection, enabling security features built into operating systems that help prevent malicious code execution, things like data execution prevention, DEP, or address space layout randomization, ASLR, these make it harder for exploits to work reliably. And disabling risky OS features like auto-run or autoplay for removable media, like USB drives, which are a common way malware spreads, is another important safeguard.
Okay, now the source material introduced a tricky tactic under this control called living off the land, or LOTO-L. Can you explain why that's particularly challenging for traditional malware defenses?
Yeah, living off the land is a really sneaky and increasingly common technique. It's where attackers, once they gain initial access, deliberately avoid using custom malware. Instead, they use legitimate tools and functionalities that are already present on the compromised system to carry out their malicious activities.
So they're using the victim's own tools against them.
Exactly. Instead of dropping a unique malware file that traditional antivirus might detect based on its signature, they leverage built-in things that IT admins use every day. Stuff like PowerShell, a powerful scripting language in Windows. WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation, for system queries and control. or other standard administrative utilities.
So the tools themselves aren't malicious, which means the antivirus might ignore them.
Precisely. The tools themselves are legitimate, trusted system components, so signature-based anti-malware often gives them a pass. It's the actions being performed with those tools that are malicious, but detecting that requires a different approach than just looking for bad files.
And the source provides a powerful example of this, illustration 1.
Yeah, the illustration 1, malware impacting medical records case involving FPMI, is a stark example of Laudal in action.
How did that play out? How does it show the danger?
Well, in that case, cybercriminals found an open port, got their initial foothold, and then instead of dropping custom malware, they used the victim's own Windows Management Instrumentation Interface, WMI. WMI is a legitimate, powerful tool. Admins use it all the time for querying system info, managing processes, even interacting with security software settings.
So the system trusted WMI.
Exactly. Because WMI was a trusted tool, the attackers could use it to do things like disable security software flags, delete log files to cover their tracks, and ultimately extract hundreds of thousands of sensitive medical records and payment card details, all without triggering the traditional signature-based alarms for a long time.
Wow.
It starkly shows why you can't just rely on blocking known bad files anymore. You also need defenses that can detect malicious behavior, even when it's carried out using legitimate, trusted tools.
That really highlights the need for more sophisticated detection, maybe looking at behavior rather than just file signatures.
Yeah.
What are the key safeguards here for Control 10?
Okay, deploying and maintaining anti-malware software, IG1, IG2, IG3, and configuring those automatic signature updates, IG1, IG2, IG3, are absolutely fundamental, universal safeguards. Everyone needs that baseline. Disabling auto-run autoplay for removable media, IG1, and configuring systems to automatically scan removable media when inserted, IG1, address specific common infection vectors.
What about those more advanced threats?
That's where other safeguards come in, enabling those anti-exploitation features on endpoints like DEP, ASLR, essentially managing your anti-malware software for better visibility and consistent policy enforcement, and critically, using behavior-based anti-malware software. This is often part of modern endpoint detection and response, or EDR, solutions. These tools monitor system processes, network connections, user activities, looking for suspicious patterns that might indicate LOD tactics, or even brand new malware, even if there's no known signature for it yet.
So looking for the abnormal behavior.
Okay.
Control 11 moves from preventing attacks to preparing for the inevitable aftermath, data recovery.
Yeah, this control is absolutely non-negotiable if you want business resilience. It focuses on establishing robust processes for backing up your critical data, regularly testing those backups to make sure they work, and having the proven capability to restore data effectively and efficiently back to a known good state after some kind of incident.
Why is recovery so vital? Isn't prevention enough?
Prevention is critical, but incidents will happen eventually. No defense is perfect. And data. It's the lifeblood of most organizations. It's vulnerable to so many threats beyond just malware. Ransomware, as we mentioned, is a huge threat that directly targets data availability by encrypting it.
Right.
But data is also vulnerable to simple human error. Someone accidentally deletes a critical folder or misconfigures something. Technical failures, hard drives die, servers crash, even physical damage from fires, floods, natural disasters. Being able to recover your critical data to a prior trusted state is often the only way to survive a major incident and keep the business operating.
Does the backup strategy need to change depending on the type of data?
Yes, absolutely. The value of the data, its sensitivity linking back to Control 03 classification, regulatory retention requirements, all these should heavily influence your backup strategy. Your most critical, highly sensitive data, it probably needs more frequent backups, maybe needs to be retained for longer periods, and definitely needs stricter security controls around the backup data itself. Less critical data might have a less demanding backup schedule.
What are some recommended best practices for doing backups?
Automating your backups whenever possible is highly recommended. It ensures consistency, reduces the chance of human error, someone forgetting to run the backup. Utilizing off-site storage is crucial.
By offsite.
It protects against site-specific disasters. If your office burns down or floods, having your only backups in the same building doesn't help. Ideally, offsite means a physically separate geographical location, and encrypting your backup data is also really important. Even if the backup tapes or drives are stolen, or the offsite storage location is somehow breached, the data itself remains protected.
I've heard of the 3-2-1 rule for backups.
Yeah, that's a common and solid best practice. It stands for: keep at least 3 copies of your important data, store the copies on 2 different types of media, e.g. disk and tape or disk and cloud, and keep at least one copy offsite. It builds in redundancy.
And you mentioned testing those backups is just as important as making them.
It's arguably more important, a backup that you can't actually restore from. It's completely useless. It gives you a false sense of security. The source really stresses the importance of regularly testing your backup functions. At least quarterly is often recommended.
How do you test them?
You actually try to restore data. Confirm that the process works, that the data is recoverable and intact. It's highly recommended to perform these restores using a separate testbed environment, if possible. That way, you can simulate a real recovery scenario without risking your live production systems. Practicing helps you identify any issues with the backup process itself, or maybe problems with your restoration procedures before you're in the middle of a real crisis.
Find the problems when the pressure is off. Makes sense. Key safeguards for data recovery.
Okay, foundational safeguards, hitting all IGs, IG1, IG2, IG3, include establishing and maintaining a data recovery process overall, performing automated backups, protecting that recovery data, often with encryption and strong access controls, and establishing and maintaining an isolated instance of recovery data that could be your offsite copy, or maybe an air-gapped backup that's disconnected from the network.
What about testing?
Testing data recovery becomes a priority safeguard for IG2 and IG3. This reflects the fact that as organizations get larger and their data becomes more complex and critical, proving that recovery works becomes even more essential.
Got it. Okay. Control 12 shifts us back to the infrastructure itself.
Right.
Network infrastructure management.
Right. This control is focused specifically on the secure management and ongoing maintenance of all your physical and virtual network devices, the gear that makes the network run.
So firewalls, routers, switches.
Exactly. Firewalls, gateways, routers, switches, wireless access points, WAPs, load balancers, VPN concentrators, any component that directs network traffic or controls network access.
Keeping the pathways themselves secure and well managed.
Precisely. A really fundamental aspect here, maybe surprisingly basic but often missed, is maintaining accurate and up-to-date documentation of your network architecture, network diagrams.
Knowing how it's all connected.
Yes. You need to know how your network is designed, where the critical devices are located physically and logically, how traffic is supposed to flow. Including critical vendor contact information for these network devices in your documentation is also important, makes it easier to get timely security updates and patches when vulnerabilities are announced. And just like with Assets and Control 01, organizations need to actively monitor for network components that are reaching their end of life or end of support dates. Running unsupported firmware on a critical router is a major security risk.
And just like with servers and workstations, default configurations and misconfigurations are big risks here too on network gear.
Absolutely. Network devices often ship with insecure default settings, default passwords, protocols like Telnet enabled instead of secure SSH, maybe overly permissive firewall rules to make initial setup easier. Or configurations can become insecure over time due to changes made, maybe errors during maintenance. You need a continuous process to identify and remediate these insecure defaults, fix misconfigurations, stop the use of insecure network protocols, and ensure you're running up-to-date, patched software firmware on all these network devices.
Are there tools to help check network configurations?
Yes. The source mentions that commercial tools exist that can help with this. They can automatically evaluate your network device configurations against established rule sets, vendor best practices, or security benchmarks like the CIS benchmarks. They can help find conflicts, insecure settings, deviations from policy. These tools can provide a really valuable sanity check, especially recommended after you make significant changes to things like firewalls, access control lists, or routing tables. Did the change break something else or open a hole?
Good point. What are some key safeguards for network infrastructure management?
Safeguards here focus on maintaining the health and security posture of the network devices themselves. Ensuring the network infrastructure software firmware is kept up to date is key. Establishing and maintaining a secure network architecture overall. Securely managing the network infrastructure on an ongoing basis, and maintaining those architecture diagrams. That's an identify function.
What about managing access to the devices?
Yeah, more specific safeguards include centralizing network authentication, authorization, and auditing, TPOA, for managing the devices themselves using systems like Radius or TACCAS Plus instead of local passwords on each device. Using secure network management protocols, only SSH instead of Telnet, SNMPv3 instead of older versions. Ensuring remote devices connecting into the network utilize a secure VPN and connect through your enterprise AAA systems for proper access control. And interestingly, establishing dedicated hardened computing resources, separate workstations or jump boxes, specifically for performing administrative work on the network.
Why the separate admin workstations?
It minimizes risk. If an admin manages the core routers from the same machine they use for email and web browsing, that machine getting compromised could lead directly to the core network being compromised. Using a separate lockdown machine just for sensitive admin tasks reduces that risk significantly.
Smart layering. Okay, building directly on managing the infrastructure is Control 13. Network monitoring and defense, so watching the traffic.
Exactly. This control is all about actively watching and defending your network infrastructure, the traffic flowing across it against both internal and external threats, ideally in real time or near real time.
Why is continuous monitoring so vital, even after you've secured the devices themselves with Control 12?
Because, again, threats are dynamic and defenses aren't perfect. Attackers are constantly finding new ways to sneak past defenses. Even with perfectly configured and patched devices, maybe a zero-day exploit emerges, or a sophisticated attacker uses novel techniques, or even just a simple human error inside your network creates an opening. Continuous monitoring is how you detect that malicious activity as it's happening, or very shortly after, giving your response team, Control 17, a chance to react before significant damage is done. The source makes the point that even really good security software needs tuning and maintenance, and the threat landscape just evolves too quickly for purely static defenses to keep up.
The source gives examples of common network attacks this control helps defend against. Can you recap those?
It does. Two classic examples mentioned are denial of service, DOC, or distributed DDoS attacks. That's where attackers flood your network or servers with so much garbage traffic that legitimate users can't get through, making your services unavailable.
Right, overwhelming the pipes.
Exactly. And ransomware is mentioned again here because it often spreads across the network from machine to machine, encrypting systems as it goes. Other threats this control helps address include network intrusion attempts, detecting data exfiltration, sensitive data being smuggled out, or even spotting internal misuse or policy violations happening on the network.
So what are the defensive and detection measures recommended here? How do you monitor effectively?
Establishing robust event logging and alerting mechanisms is foundational. Feeding those network device logs, firewall logs, etc., into a SIEM, as we discussed back in Control 08, is absolutely key here for centralized visibility.
Okay, logs are step one. What else?
Beyond just logs, monitoring the actual traffic flow patterns is crucial. Tools exist that can analyze network traffic metadata, NetFlow, SFlow, etc., to spot unusual activity. Things like unexpectedly large amounts of data leaving the network to an external address could be data exfiltration, or systems suddenly talking to other systems they never normally talk to could be lateral movement.
And specific security tools.
Yeah, detection and prevention safeguards involve deploying tools like Network Intrusion Detection Systems, NIDS, which watch for malicious patterns in traffic, or Network Intrusion Prevention Systems, NIPS, which can actively block malicious traffic. Next-generation firewalls, NGFWs, offer more advanced filtering capabilities, often understanding applications, not just ports and protocols. Data loss prevention, DLP systems, can inspect network traffic for sensitive data trying to leave. And endpoint detection and response EDR systems, while agent-based on endpoints, provide crucial network context and can coordinate responses like isolating a compromised machine from the network.
And who typically handles all this monitoring? It sounds like a full-time job.
It definitely is, especially for larger organizations. They often have dedicated security operations centers, SOCs, or sometimes network operations centers, NOCs, staffed 247 by analysts who continuously monitor alerts, investigate suspicious activity, and initiate responses.
What about smaller organizations?
For smaller orgs that can't afford a dedicated SOC, this function is very, very commonly outsourced to managed security service providers, or MSSPs. They have the specialized tools, infrastructure, and personnel to provide that round-the-clock monitoring and initial response capability as a service.
Makes sense. What are the key safeguards for network monitoring and defense?
Centralizing security event alerting, IG1, IG2, IG3, is a foundational safeguard, making sure all the important alarms from different tools go to one place for analysis. Deploying some form of host-based or network-based intrusion detection solution is vital, IG1, IG2, IG3, depending on the scope and whether it's just detection or prevention. Performing traffic filtering between network segments using internal firewalls or VLAN ACLs, IG1, IG2, IG3, is crucial for limiting the spread of threats if one part of the network gets compromised containment. Managing access controls for remote assets connecting in, using VPNs linking back to Control 12, is also relevant here.
What about more advanced safeguards?
For higher IGs, IG2, IG3, priorities include collecting detailed network traffic flow logs, like NetFlow, for deeper analysis, deploying host-based or network intrusion prevention solutions, NIPS, that can actively block threats, implementing port-level access control like 802.1x on network switches to prevent unauthorized devices from just plugging into the network, performing application layer filtering using those NGFWs, and, really importantly, continuously tuning your security event alerting thresholds.
Tuning the alerts. Why is that important?
Because if your tools generate thousands of meaningless alerts every day, false positives, your analysts will get overwhelmed and start ignoring them. Tuning helps reduce that noise, ensuring that the alerts that do fire are more likely to represent real threats that need investigation. It keeps the analysts focused.
Got it. Quality over quantity for alerts. Okay, let's shift gears significantly now. Control 14 moves away from technology and focuses on the people. Security awareness and skills training.
Yeah, this control is absolutely critical because it recognizes that technology, no matter how good, isn't enough on its own. Security is also about people. This control is about establishing and maintaining a security awareness program and conducting regular training to reduce the significant risks posed by employees, whether intentional or unintentional.
Because uninformed or untrained employees can be a major weak link.
They are often cited year after year in breach reports as one of the greatest risks organizations face. Threats can come from those external social engineering attacks we mentioned: phishing, voice phishing, pretexting that target employees directly, trying to manipulate them. Or risks can come from internal factors: simple human error, negligence like losing a laptop or sharing passwords, or accidental misuse of systems or data.
And social engineering can bypass technical defenses.
It absolutely can. A convincing phisher's email or a persuasive phone call can trick even savvy users into giving up credentials or installing malware, completely bypassing firewalls and antivirus. The impact can be huge: significant operational disruption, direct financial loss, like in BEC scams, and major reputational damage if customer data is compromised due to an employee being tricked.
So training is the primary way to build that human firewall, to mitigate this risk.
It's the fundamental way to build a security-aware culture, yes. The training needs to cover practical, relevant topics. Things like how to recognize the signs of social engineering, attacks, suspicious emails, urgent requests, things that seem too good to be true. Best practices for creating strong, unique passwords and handling authentication methods securely. Safe data handling procedures, especially understanding data classification, Control ZOO3, and how to treat sensitive data appropriately. Understanding the risks of using insecure networks like public Wi-Fi or connecting unauthorized personal devices to the corporate network. And really importantly, knowing how to recognize and report a potential security incident or concern quickly and without fear of getting in trouble. You want people to report things.
And this training shouldn't just be a once-a-year check-the-box exercise.
Absolutely not. That's notoriously ineffective. The source emphasizes that training needs to be more frequent, maybe quarterly updates, monthly security tips, and critically, it needs to be relevant and engaging. People tune out boring compliance training.
How do you make it engaging?
Use real-world examples. Reference recent, well-publicized data breaches that people might have heard about. Highlight seasonal scams like tax-related phishing during tax season or fake shopping deals around holidays. Warn about common social engineering lures like fake urgent requests from the CEO or fake prize notifications. Making the training relatable to employees' daily work and even their personal online safety makes it much more likely to stick. And role-specific training is also key.
Training tailored to different jobs.
Yeah. Employees in finance need different training than developers. People handling sensitive customer data need specific guidance. Executives face unique threats like spear phishing. Tailoring the content makes it more impactful.
Makes sense. What are the key safeguards for Control 14? They probably cover a lot of ground.
They do, and they apply broadly. The asset type is often listed as NA because it's about people. They mostly fall under the protect function, aiming to protect the organization through employee awareness. Establishing and maintaining a security awareness program overall, IG1, IG2, IG3, is the starting point.
And specific training topics.
Yes, training workforce members to recognize social engineering attacks, IG1, IG2, IG3. Training them on secure authentication best practices, IG1, IG2, IG3. Training on the common causes of unintentional data exposure, how accidents happen, IG1, IG2, IG3. And training on how to recognize and properly report security incidents, IG1, IG2, IG3. These are all universal foundational safeguards for everyone.
What about higher IGs?
For IG2 and IG3, priorities include training the workforce on how to identify and report if security updates seem to be missing on their assets, getting more eyes on potential problems. Training on the specific dangers of connecting to insecure networks, like public Wi-Fi, and transmitting company data over them, IG1, IG2, IG3, but maybe with more emphasis in higher IGs. And conducting that role-specific security awareness and skills training tailored to different job functions and the specific risks they face, IG2, IG3.
Okay, building that human layer of defense. Control 15 takes us back outside the organization, looking at risks introduced by partners. Service provider management.
Right. This control focuses squarely on managing the cybersecurity risks that come along with using third-party service providers, vendors, suppliers, contractors, particularly those who have access to your sensitive data or manage critical IT functions on your behalf. Cloud providers, MSPs, SaaS vendors, payroll processors, the list is long these days.
And as companies rely more and more on these external services, the risk surface expands, right?
Hugely. It's a rapidly growing area of risk for almost every organization. The core challenge is that your service providers might have different, potentially lower security standards than your own internal policies demand, and holding them accountable can be tricky.
Why is it tricky?
Well, partly because, as the source notes, there's often a lack of universally adopted public cybersecurity standards that all service providers must meet across every single industry. There are exceptions. The source mentions things like shared assessments, which is common in financial services, or HEC VAT, which is used in higher education. These provide sector-specific frameworks for vendor risk assessment. But many industries lack these widely accepted benchmarks, making consistent assessment harder.
So you really need a formal process internally for managing those vendor relationships from a security perspective. You can't just assume they're secure.
Absolutely not. Assuming is dangerous. The recommendation is crystal clear. Establish a comprehensive service provider management process, and this process needs to cover the entire relationship lifecycle.
From start to finish.
Exactly. It starts before you even sign a contract during the due diligence phase. It continues throughout the active relationship, and it includes specific steps for how you securely end the relationship when the contract is over or you switch providers.
What does that process actually involve day to day or maybe year to year?
Key activities include initially assessing a potential provider's security posture and capabilities before you engage them. Due diligence is key. Throughout the relationship, you need to somehow catalog their performance and standards, ensuring they're actually adhering to the security requirements you agreed upon in the contract.
So monitoring them.
Some level of monitoring, yes. Especially for providers handling critical functions or highly sensitive data, this might involve reviewing their audit reports, maybe periodic questionnaires, or even audits depending on the risk level. And finally, you need a clear process to securely decommission a service provider relationship. That means ensuring they no longer have any access to your systems or data, and ensuring your data is securely returned to you or verifiably destroyed according to the contract.
The source mentions SOC reports here as a way to assess vendors.
Yes, System and Organization Controls, or SOC reports, particularly SOC2 reports, are a very common mechanism used to assess the risks associated with a service provider, especially SaaS vendors and data centers. Its SOC2 report provides independent assurance from an auditor about the effectiveness of a provider's controls related to 5 trust services criteria: security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. Reviewing a vendor's SOC2 report is a standard part of due diligence for many organizations.
Okay, key safeguards for service provider management.
Foundational safeguards, hitting IG1, IG2, IG3, include establishing and maintaining an inventory of all your service providers. Again, you need to know who they are, what they do for you, and what data they access. Just knowing who your vendors are is step 1.
What about for higher IGs?
For IG2 and IG3, the priorities become more formalized. Establishing a formal service provider management policy document. Classifying your service providers based on the level of risk they pose. Is this a critical vendor handling sensitive data or someone providing office supplies? Ensuring that your service provider contracts include specific, measurable cybersecurity requirements and clauses about things like breach notification, performing actual security assessments of those providers periodically, monitoring their performance against requirements, that's a detect function, and having that process for securely decommissioning service providers when the relationship ends, an IG2 priority, protect function.
Right, managing that whole life cycle.
Okay.
Okay, Control 16 dives into application software security. This feels related to Control 02, software inventory, but maybe goes deeper.
Exactly. It goes much deeper into securing the applications themselves throughout their entire lifecycle. This applies whether those applications are developed internally by your own teams, whether you acquire them off the shelf from a third-party vendor, or whether you consume them as a cloud-based software as a service, SaaS offering. The goal is to detect, deter, and resolve security weaknesses within the software code and design before those weaknesses can be exploited by attackers.
And software development seems more complex and faster than ever these days. Does that make this harder?
It definitely does. Modern software development often involves really rapid iteration cycles, agile development, DevOps. Teams are frequently leveraging existing code libraries, pulling in open source components, stitching together APIs from different places, all mixed in with new custom code they write themselves. This complexity absolutely increases the potential for subtle, dangerous vulnerabilities to be introduced at various stages. It's easy for things to slip through the cracks.
What are the common ways vulnerabilities get into applications?
They can stem from all sorts of places. Flaws in the initial application design or architecture, running on insecure underlying infrastructure. Simple coding errors, even small mistakes in input validation or error handling can have big security implications. Poor implementations of authentication or session management, or just insufficient security testing during the development process.
The source gives some classic examples of application vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it mentions several well-known types that are still actively exploited today. Buffer overflows, where you can write data past the intended memory space, potentially overwriting critical instructions. Cross-site scripting, or XSS, where attackers inject malicious scripts into websites viewed by other users. SQL injection, where attackers manipulate database queries to steal or modify data. Race conditions, where the timing of operations can be exploited.
And these aren't just theoretical bugs, they can lead to real compromises.
Absolutely. Exploiting these kinds of vulnerabilities can allow attackers to gain unauthorized access to data, modify application behavior, bypass security controls, or even escalate their privileges within the application, or sometimes on the underlying server itself. Escalating privileges means an attacker might start as a low-privilege user, but find a flaw that lets them become an administrator, gaining much wider control.
So the key must be building security into the development process itself, right? Not just trying to bolt it on at the end.
That is absolutely critical. This concept is often referred to as shifting left on security, meaning you integrate security practices as early as possible into the software development lifecycle, SDLC. Waiting until the end is too late and too expensive.
What does that look like in practice?
It means IT managers and development leads need to ensure things like secure design principles are followed from the start. Secure coding standards are adopted and enforced. Code reviews explicitly include looking for security flaws, not just functional bugs, and security testing tools like Static Application Security Testing, SAST, that analyzes source code, and Dynamic Application Security Testing, DAY, that tests the running application are used early and often throughout the development process. Trying to fix deep architectural security flaws right before launch, or worse, after deployment, it's exponentially harder, slower, and more costly than catching them early.
And managing third-party code is part of this, too.
Yes. Inventorying those third-party software components and libraries used in your applications is vital, linking back to Control02, but also Control 16. You need to know what you're using so you can track vulnerabilities discovered in those components and update them promptly. You also need to review their configurations and maybe implement compensating controls if a third-party component has known issues you can't immediately fix.
You mentioned SaaS earlier. What about that SaaS blind spot the source refers to in this context?
Yeah, this is a real challenge when you're using software as a service platforms. With SaaS, the application is hosted and managed entirely by the vendor, right? As the customer, you typically have very limited, if any, visibility into their internal development processes, their code review practices, how they do security testing, or how they harden the infrastructure the application runs on.
So you basically have to trust that the SaaS vendor is doing things securely.
To a large extent, yes, you're relying on their security practices. The source recommends that organizations using SaaS, especially if that service handles sensitive data, should actively ask the provider about their secure development practices. What standards do they follow? How do they test? And, as we discussed under Service Provider Management, Control 15, requesting and reviewing relevant SOC reports, like SOC2 Type 2, or other independent third-party audit reports, is a key way to gain some level of assurance about the provider's security controls without having direct visibility into their internal operations.
Okay. The source also mentions bug bounty programs. How do those fit in?
Bug bounty programs are a proactive approach, often used by larger organizations or software vendors, to find vulnerabilities in their applications. They essentially crowdsource security testing by offering incentives, usually recognition and more monetary rewards to individuals, often external security researchers, not sometimes employees too, who find and responsibly report security flaws in their software.
So paying people to hack you ethically.
Pretty much. It can be a cost-effective way to uncover vulnerabilities that your internal testing processes might have missed. It also helps build a positive relationship with the security research community and can even foster a bit of healthy internal competition if employees participate.
What are the key safeguards for application software security? It seems like a big area.
It is. The safeguards cover that whole spectrum, from development to testing to acquisition and maintenance. Establishing and maintaining a secure application development process, IG1, IG2, IG3, is foundational. Having a defined process to accept and address reported software vulnerabilities, whether found internally or externally, is also key. IG1, IG2, IG3. Inventorying those third-party software components, IG1, IG2, IG3, and making sure you use up-to-date and trusted components, IG1, IG2, IG3, are crucial hygiene steps. Separating production environments from non-production, development, testing environments, IG1, IG2, IG3, is a universal best practice to prevent development mistakes from impacting live users or data.
What about safeguards more focused on secure coding and testing?
For higher IGs, IG2, IG3, priorities include formally training developers in application security concepts and secure coding techniques, applying secure design principles early in the application architecture phase, leveraging vetted, pre-approved modules or services for common security functions, like authentication or encryption, instead of rolling your own. Implementing code-level security checks using tools like SAST and DEST, IG2, IG3, conducting formal application penetration testing specifically targeting the application's logic and workflows, IG2, IG3, and performing threat modeling during the design phase to proactively identify potential attack vectors and design defenses for them, IG2, IG3.
Okay, that's comprehensive for securing the apps. Control 17 is incident response management, planning for when things go wrong.
Exactly. This control is all about being prepared for the inevitable security incident, despite all your preventative measures from the other controls. It's about establishing a formal program to effectively detect, respond to, contain, eradicate, and recover from cybersecurity attacks or breaches.
And incidents aren't just technical problems, right? They have much wider impacts.
Absolutely. A significant security incident can cause major operational downtime, direct financial losses from theft, extortion, recovery costs, and severe damage to your organization's reputation and customer trust. And increasingly, incidents have major legal and regulatory consequences.
Like breach notification laws.
Precisely. Many laws and regulations around the world, like HIPAA in U.S. healthcare, GDPR in Europe, CCPA in California, state-level breach laws, mandate specific actions, including timely notification to affected individuals and regulatory bodies following a data breach involving personal information. Failure to comply can result in hefty fines, lawsuits, and other legal liabilities. Having a well-defined, practiced incident response plan is crucial not just for technical recovery, but also for navigating the complex legal, compliance, and public relations aspects of a breach.
So what are the core components of a good incident response program?
The source highlights several key elements. You need to designate specific personnel who are responsible for managing incident handling, maybe a primary point of contact, or a core incident response team leader. You need to establish that dedicated incident response team, even if it's virtual or includes external help, with clearly defined roles and responsibilities, who does what during the chaos of an incident, who makes decisions, who communicates.
Communication seems key.
Critically key. Developing clear communication plans in advance is vital. You need to know who to notify internally. Senior management, legal counsel, HR, relevant business units. Who are the external stakeholders you might need to communicate with? Customers, partners, the media. And how and when do you need to communicate with regulatory agencies or law enforcement, if applicable? Figuring this out during a crisis is a recipe for disaster.
And just having a plan isn't enough. You need to practice it.
Critically important. Just like fire drills prepare you for a fire, incident response exercises prepare you for a cyber attack. The source really stresses periodically carrying out exercises. These could be simulations, maybe tabletop exercises where you talk through a scenario, or even more technical drills to test the effectiveness of your plan, identify gaps or weaknesses, and find areas for improvement before you're dealing with a high-stress, real-world incident.
Learn lessons when the stakes are lower.
Exactly. And conducting formal post-incident reviews after every significant real incident or even a major exercise is also vital for capturing lessons learned and refining your process for next time. Continuous improvement. Establishing clear security incident thresholds is also important, defining what level of event actually triggers the formal incident response plan versus something handled through normal IT support.
What are the key safeguards for incident response management?
Foundational safeguards, hitting all IGs, IG1, IG2, IG3, include designating personnel responsible for incident handling, establishing clear contact information for reporting incidents, how do employees raise the alarm, and establishing an enterprise-wide process for reporting incidents. Establishing and managing the overall incident response process itself, the plan, is also IG1, IG2, IG3. Assigning those key roles and responsibilities within the plan, IG1, IG2, IG3.
What about the communication and practice elements?
Defining the mechanisms for communicating during incident response becomes an IG2, IG3 priority. Conducting those routine incident response exercises, IG2, IG3, this falls under the recover function in CISV8, as exercises improve readiness for recovery. Conducting post-incident reviews, also IG2, IG3, and recover, for learning, and establishing those security incident thresholds, IG2, IG3, and recover, are generally priorities for more mature organizations, reflecting the increased complexity of their potential incidents and the need for more formalized practice, communication, and learning loops.
Got it. Preparedness is key. Okay, last but not least, Control 18, penetration testing. This sounds like putting all the other defenses to the test.
That's exactly what it is. It's one of the most direct ways to actively test the effectiveness and sophistication of your overall security defenses. It involves simulating actual attacks against your own systems, network, applications, even people, to identify vulnerabilities and, crucially, see if those vulnerabilities can actually be exploited to achieve an attacker's objectives.
So you're essentially hiring ethical hackers to try and break into your systems.
That's a pretty good way to think about it, yeah. The primary purpose of penetration testing, or pen testing, isn't just to find a list of vulnerabilities. That's what vulnerability scanning in Control-07 does more efficiently. Pen testing aims to demonstrate whether a motivated attacker could actually exploit those vulnerabilities, potentially bypass your existing security controls like firewalls, IDS, anti-malware, and achieve a specific goal.
Like what kind of goal?
Could be gaining unauthorized access to sensitive data, taking administrative control of critical systems, disrupting operations, proving they could move laterally through the network undetected. It verifies that your defenses work as intended in a real attack scenario, and it helps ensure you have the right defenses in place against the kinds of sophisticated attacks you might face. It finds the gaps that automated scanners might miss.
How does it differ significantly from that vulnerability scanning we talked about way back in Control-07? They sound related.
They are related, but different in scope and depth. Vulnerability scanning is typically automated, broader, and focuses on identifying known weaknesses based on signatures and configurations. It's like getting an architect's report listing all the potential cracks in your building's walls. Penetration testing is usually a more manual or semi-automated process, often more targeted, and it goes that crucial step further. It actively tries to exploit those identified cracks to see if they can actually be used to break into the building, move around inside undetected, and maybe steal the valuables. It simulates a real attacker's mindset, creativity, and persistence.
The source mentions red team exercises too. How do those relate?
Red team exercises are a related, often more advanced form of testing. They are typically even more targeted and objective-driven than a standard penetration test. A red team exercise might focus on simulating the specific tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, used by a particular known adversary group that targets your industry, specifically to test your organization's detection and response capabilities against that specific type of attacker. It's less about finding every vulnerability and more about testing the entire defensive chain, people, process, technology, against a realistic threat scenario.
And the source mentioned that the type and frequency of penetration testing might depend on your industry's risk level.
Absolutely. Industries that handle vast amounts of highly sensitive or critical data, think healthcare with patient records, or financial institutions with money and financial data, are prime targets for sophisticated attackers. They also often face significant regulatory requirements that mandate regular, rigorous penetration testing as part of their compliance obligations. So the risk profile of the organization and its regulatory environment directly dictates the need for and the intensity of this type of testing.
The example from First Payment Network, Inc. seemed to illustrate how specific this testing can become.
Yeah, that's a fantastic concrete example from the source material. First Payment Network, a credit card processing company, was developing innovative new payment technology based on biorecognition using fingerprints for payments. To ensure this cutting-edge system was secure before they rolled it out, they didn't just do a generic network pen
What
test.
did they do?
They engaged a specialized managed service provider, an MSP, that specialized in red team exercises specifically for financial transaction systems and biometric security. The test wasn't just a broad, can you get into our network? It was highly focused on specific high-risk business scenarios. Could an attacker realistically forge a fingerprint to bypass the biometric check? Could they intercept or bypass the software code that required that biometric validation during a payment transaction? It shows how pen testing can and should be tailored to test the security of unique business processes and your most valuable assets against very specific, relevant threats.
So what's the general process or life cycle for a typical penetration test?
As outlined in the source, it usually starts with a discovery and observation phase, sometimes called reconnaissance, where the testers gather information about the target organization and its environment. What IPs are public? What tech do they use? This is often followed by scanning to identify potential entry points and vulnerabilities, leveraging techniques similar to Control-07. Then comes the core of the test, the exploitation phase, where they actively attempt to use those identified vulnerabilities to gain access, escalate privileges, maybe pivot to other systems, lateral movement. Finally, there's an analysis phase where they document their findings, what worked, what didn't, which controls were effective, which were bypassed, resulting in a detailed report. And that report should then feed back into remediation efforts, improving controls, linking back to secure configuration, CO4, vulnerability management, CO7, etc.
And how often is this typically recommended for organizations?
The source suggests that penetration tests should be performed at least annually for large organizations or those with significant cybersecurity risk, and potentially more frequently for organizations in those high-risk or highly regulated sectors, or maybe after significant changes to the network or key applications.
Makes sense. What are the key safeguards for penetration testing?
Okay, the safeguards here fall under the identify function because testing identifies weaknesses, and also protect because the goal is remediation and validation of security. Key safeguards include establishing and maintaining a formal penetration testing program, an IG2, IG3 priority, performing periodic external penetration tests, targeting your internet-facing infrastructure is a key IG2, IG3 priority testing your perimeter.
What about internal testing?
For the most mature organizations, IG3, performing periodic internal penetration tests is also crucial. This simulates an attacker who has already gained initial access inside the network, maybe through phishing or malware, and tests how far they can get from there. And critically, there are safeguards focused on actually remediating the findings from penetration tests, IG2, IG3. You have to fix what they find, and then validating that those remediation efforts were actually successful, IG2, IG3, perhaps through retesting, to ensure the exercise leads to tangible security improvements.
Wow, okay. That was an incredibly comprehensive run through all 18 controls and many of their associated safeguards. It really covers the gamut, doesn't it? From the absolute fundamentals like knowing your assets and software, all the way through securing configurations, managing accounts and access, protecting the data itself, monitoring the network, training your people, managing vendors, securing your applications, being ready to respond to incidents, and finally actively testing your own defenses.
It really does illustrate how the CIS controls provide this structured, prioritized, and importantly, threat-informed approach to building cybersecurity resilience. They guide you from that foundational hygiene that's suitable for literally any organization, up through increasingly advanced defenses for those with higher risk profiles and more resources. And it's all grounded in understanding real-world attacker behavior and designed to be practical and measurable.
So, having dived this deep into the framework, really understanding its core principles, how it's tailored through those implementation groups, and exploring the specifics of each control from asset visibility right through to proactive testing, what does this whole comprehensive structure suggest? What kind of mindset do you think we need to adopt when we approach cybersecurity, regardless of our organization's size or complexity?
That's really the key takeaway, isn't it? The fact that these CIS controls are continuously updated, driven by analyzing actual attacker behavior, and that they're structured into those implementation groups based on capacity and risk, it tells us something fundamental. Cybersecurity isn't some static destination you arrive at. It's not a project you finish.
It's a process.
It's absolutely a dynamic journey. It requires a mindset of continuous improvement, of realistic self-assessment, where are we really on that IG scale, and a commitment to agile adaptation. because the threats change, your business changes, technology changes.
Mhm.
It underscores that you can't just protect against theoretical threats from a textbook. You have to focus your limited energy and resources on the threats you are most likely to face right now, based on real-world intelligence, with the resources you actually have available, while always being prepared to learn, adjust, and adapt as both your organization and the threat landscape inevitably evolve. It's really about building a living, breathing defense based on reality, not just ticking boxes on a static checklist once a year.
That perspective makes it feel less like this insurmountable, overwhelming task and more like a strategic, manageable, ongoing process. Still hard work, but manageable.
Precisely. Hard work, yes, but it's a journey with a clear, prioritized map provided by frameworks like the CIS controls.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the CIS critical security controls. Thank you so much for guiding us through these really crucial concepts and providing that fantastic level of detail.
Oh, my pleasure. I really hope this breakdown gives everyone listening a clearer understanding of what the controls are all about and maybe empowers you to think strategically about how these principles could apply within your own work or learning context. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep learning.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep diving deep.